In the early months of 1733, London was a city of more than 500,000 souls. It was the largest city in England, the center of commerce, law, and government. The Thames divided it. Bridges connected its parts. The streets were narrow and crowded. Most buildings were constructed of brick and timber. Fires were common. Disease was common. Death was common. The population was dense, and the conditions in which many lived were poor. There was no organized police force. Watchmen patrolled at night. Constables were appointed by the parishes. Justice was administered locally, and punishment was often public. Executions took place in the open air, at Tyburn or at other designated sites, and they drew large crowds. The legal profession was concentrated in the Inns of Court, a cluster of buildings near Fleet Street, between the City of London and the Palace of Westminster. The Inner Temple and the Middle Temple were two of the four inns. They were ancient institutions dating back to the medieval period. Barristers lived and worked there. Judges resided there. The buildings were arranged around courtyards. The chambers were led to lawyers and to others with connections to the legal world. The area was relatively prosperous and relatively secure, though it was not immune to crime. Sarah Malcolm was born in Ireland around the year 1710 or 1711. Her family background is not well documented. She was described in later accounts as having been educated and as having come from a respectable family. She moved to London at some point in her youth. By the early 1730s, she was employed as heiress. She washed and mended clothing for gentlemen who lived in the Temple. The work was physically demanding and poorly paid. She was unmarried. She lived in lodgings near Shoreditch in the northern part of the city. She was approximately 22 years old. Among her clients was a Mr. John Carroll, a gentleman who occupied chambers in the Inner Temple. She had also been employed on occasion to do chair work for other residents. One of these was Mrs. Lydia Dunham, a widow who lived in Tanfield Court, 4 flights of stairs above the ground. Mrs. Duncan was approximately 80 years old. She had lived in the Temple for 40 years. She was bedridden and infirm. Her late husband had left her a modest fortune. She lived quietly, attended by 2 servants. The older of the 2 servants was Elizabeth Harrison. She had been with Mrs. Dunham for many years. She was approximately 60 years old and in poor health herself, but Mrs. Dunham had kept her on out of loyalty and affection. The younger servant was Anne Price, a girl of about 17. She had been hired 3 months earlier to perform the heavier work that Elizabeth Harrison could no longer manage. The household was small, quiet, and unremarkable. Mrs. Dunham kept her money in a locked box in her chamber. She entrusted the key to a friend, Mrs. Frances Rear, who also served as her executor. The arrangement was known to those who visited the household. Sarah Malcolm had worked as a chairwoman for Mrs. Dunham until shortly before Christmas in 1732. She had therefore been inside the chambers on numerous occasions. She knew the layout. She knew the routines. She knew that Mrs. Duncan was wealthy and that she kept money in her rooms. Sarah Malcolm was also acquainted with other individuals. Among them were a woman named Mary Tracy and 2 brothers, James Alexander and Thomas Alexander. The nature of these relationships is not entirely clear, but they were later described as accomplices. On the evening of Saturday, February 3, 1733, Sarah Malcolm visited Mrs. Dunham's chambers. She arrived at approximately 8 o'clock. She said she had come to inquire about the health of Elizabeth Harrison. Another visitor, Mrs. Anne Oliphant, who was a layress for a Mr. Grizzly, and whose master's chambers were directly opposite Mrs. Dunham's, was also present. The 2 women spoke briefly with Mrs. Dunham and with Elizabeth Harrison. They left together shortly before 8 o'clock. Mrs. Anne Love, a friend of Mrs. Dunk's, remained in the chambers for another quarter of an hour and then departed. The door was secured. It had a spring lock and a bolt on the inside. The following day was Sunday, February 4th, 1733. Mrs. Anne Love returned to Mrs. Dunham's chambers at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She had been invited to dine. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. She waited. She knocked again. Still no answer. She went downstairs and inquired whether anyone had seen the servants. No one had. She returned to the door and knocked again. She concluded that Elizabeth Harrison must have died during the night, and that Anne Price had been sent to inform the girl's sister. She went to fetch Mrs. Frances Rymer, who lived nearby in the temple. The two women returned together. They knocked. There was no response. They became concerned. They asked Mrs. Anne Oliphant for assistance. Mrs. Oliphant suggested that she might be able to enter Mrs. Dunham's chambers by climbing out of Mr. Grizzly's window, crossing the gutter, and breaking into Mrs. Dunham's window. Mr. Grizzly had left his chambers earlier in the week, and Mrs. Oliphant had been given the keys. She climbed out onto the leads, broke a pane of glass in Mrs. Duncan's window, opened the casement, and climbed inside. She went to the door. It was locked and bolted. She unbolted it and opened it. Mrs. Love and Mrs. Rymer entered. In the passage, they found the body of Anne Price. She was lying on her bed. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear. Her hands were clenched. Her hair was loose and hanging over her eyes. There was a great deal of blood. In the next room, they found Elizabeth Harrison. She was lying on a press bed. She had been strangled. Her throat bore marks of scratching. In the adjoining chamber, they found Mrs. Lydia Dunham. She was lying across her bed. She had also been strangled. Her strong black box in which she kept her money had been broken open. The contents were gone. The alarm was raised. Watchmen and constables were summoned. A crowd gathered. The bodies were examined. The chambers were searched. There were no signs of forced entry other than the broken window through which Mrs. Oliphant had climbed. The door had been bolted from the inside. It was not immediately clear how the murderer or murderers had entered or exited. The staircase windows had recently been barred. The only other possibility was that someone had entered through Mr. Grizzly's chambers, which had a lock that Mrs. Oliphant described as weak and easily picked. The murders caused considerable alarm in the temple. Those who lived there realized that their security depended on the trustworthiness of the servants and tradespeople to whom they gave keys or access. An investigation was begun. Inquiries were made among the Laresses, chairwomen, and others who had been employed by Mrs. Dunham, or who had visited her chambers recently. Sarah Malcolm spent Sunday morning in the chambers of Mr. John Carroll. She arrived at approximately 9 o'clock. Mr. Carroll and a friend, Mr. John Gagin, breakfasted together. Sarah Malcolm made tea for them. She remained in the chambers until the horn sounded for commons. At around 1 o'clock, she then left. Mr. Carroll and Mr. Gagin went out. They heard of the murders while walking through Tanfield Court. They went to a coffee house in Covent Garden where the murders were being discussed. It was generally believed that the crime must have been committed by someone familiar with Mrs. Dunham's household, possibly a Laresses. Mr. Carroll and Mr. Gagin remained out until after midnight. They went to a tavern in Essex Street and stayed there until 1 o'clock on Monday morning. They then returned to the temple. When Mr. Carroll entered his chambers, he found Sarah Malcolm there. The door was open. There was a fire and a candle burning. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning. He was surprised to see her at such an hour. He asked her if anyone had been taken up for the murders. She said no, but that a gentleman who had. Chambers below Mrs. Dunham's had been absent for several days, and was suspected. Mr. Carroll said that he would not employ anyone who had been acquainted with Mrs. Dunham until the murderer was found. He told her to gather his things and leave. Mr. Gahagan went downstairs to call the watch, but had difficulty with the door and returned. Mr. Carroll went down himself and brought 2 watchmen back with him. Mr. Carroll began to examine his belongings. He noticed that some of his waistcoats were missing. He asked Sarah Malcolm what had become of them. She asked to speak with him privately. He refused. She then admitted that she had pawned them at a shop in Drury Lane for 2 guineas. She begged him not to be angry. He said he was less concerned about the waistcoats than about his suspicion that she was involved in the murders. He noticed a bundle lying on the floor of the closet. He asked what it was. She said it was an old gown of hers, and that it contained a shift and an apron, but that they were not proper for a man to see. He did not open it at that time. He told the watchman to take her to the watch-house. She was led away. After she had gone, Mr. Carroll and Mr. Gahagan searched the chambers more thoroughly. Under the bed, they found another bundle. In the close stool, they found more linen and a silver tankard. The handle of the tankard was bloody. They immediately went to find the watchman. One of the watchmen said he had let Sarah Malcolm go. On her promise to return at 10 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Carroll ordered him to find her again. The watchman went to the temple gate and found her sitting between 2 other watchmen. She was brought back. Mr. Carroll showed her the tankard and the bloody linen. He asked if they were hers. She said yes. She said the tankard had been left to her by her mother. She said the handle was bloody because she had cut her finger. She showed him a small prick on her finger. He asked about the